He ruled half the world, yet every night he was terrified of being left alone. His bedroom was never a place of rest, but a stage for torment. The muffled sobs of the young queen, the king's stifled moans, and that one sound behind the velvet curtains that palace guards would never forget. No one dared intervene. No one left those rooms, not even his wife. What happened behind closed doors became a forbidden history, the kind never taught in schools or carved into monuments. There was only him, Philip V of Spain, a man whose obsessions made him a prisoner of his own desires, turning the royal bed into a cage. But to understand how Europe's greatest monarch became a shadow of himself, we must go back to his childhood, to the first cracks in his mind. Philip was called the Silent Bourbon. Born in 1683 into the glittering French royal family, he seemed out of place from the start. While other children played in the gardens of Versailles, he stayed quiet, staring into emptiness for hours. His gaze seemed fixed on an invisible wall, his body so still that servants would check if he was even breathing. Tutors complained that he showed no interest, no emotion. He ignored praise, and punishment meant nothing. It was as if he lived outside of time, locked in his own world. The only person he clung to was his mother, Maria Anna of Bavaria. Gentle and protective, she was not just a parent, but his shield against the world. In her presence, he found rare moments of calm that no one else could give him. But when she died suddenly of illness, the boy seemed to die with her. There were no screams, no tears, only silence. From that moment, he withdrew completely. Servants recalled that he stopped speaking, spending entire days alone, unreachable. Some historians believe this was the first sign of his troubled mind. Others say it was trauma, a wound that never healed. Whatever the cause, that emptiness stayed with him for life. Unlike his cousins, trained to shine at court, Philip was a stranger, cold, withdrawn, and nothing like a future heir. Yet, fate had other plans. When older relatives died unexpectedly, this quiet boy was pushed into the center of European ambition. At 17, he was placed on the Spanish throne. A teenager with no experience, no military knowledge, and no command of the language, suddenly became ruler of an empire. At his coronation, he looked like an outsider. No smile, no emotion. He stood like a statue among richly dressed courtiers, as if he himself couldn't believe it was real. Spain watched him warily, seeing not a king, but a foreigner given their crown. And in this cold and hostile world, he did what he had always done. He clung to a woman. In 1701, Philip married Maria Louisa of Savoy. She was 13, he was 17. For the dynasty, it was a political match, but for the young king, she was salvation. He held on to her with the same desperate intensity he once reserved for his mother. At first, it looked innocent. He followed her everywhere, listened to every word, looked at her with a focus no one else ever received. Courtiers found it touching. The king finally showed some emotion. But tenderness soon became something darker. In her presence, he was calm, but without her, he panicked. This was not love in the ordinary sense. It was dependence. He could not eat unless she was beside him. He could not sleep unless he touched her. Even in council meetings, he demanded she sit next to him, or else he lost the ability to speak. Slowly, Maria Luisa realized she was not a wife, but a shadow chained to her husband.
For the young queen, it was a heavy burden. At just 13, she found herself in a foreign land, bound not to a court, but to one man's obsession. At first, she treated it as duty, to support the king, to help him rule. But soon whispers spread. Spain had no ruler, only a man who could not function without his wife. Advisors tried to excuse Philip's oddities. Some said he was young, others claimed his passion was proof of true love. but the nights revealed the truth. At 2 or 3 in the morning, the palace corridors echoed with cries, sobs, and screams. Guards on duty looked at each other in fear. Behind the curtains, the sounds were not of sickness or intimacy, but something far more disturbing. The Queen's desperate prayers mixed with the King's frantic, childlike wailing. Maria Luisa became a prisoner, literally forbidden to leave his side and figuratively stripped of her life. She could not walk in the gardens, speak with ladies at court, or even sleep alone. Any attempt to step away, even for minutes, sent Philip into hysteria, as if his very life were being torn away. Her body began to show the strain. She lost weight, her eyes dulled, her voice grew weak. And yet the weight of Spain's government fell on her. Since Philip refused to leave his chambers, she issued orders, signed decrees, received ambassadors. She became the invisible queen, rarely seen, but her words shaped the nation. It was a strange double rule, a fragile young girl giving commands from the edge of a bed, while her husband clutched her wrist to stop her from leaving. The Spanish court was reduced to shadows, enslaved by the whims of an obsessed man and the endurance of a woman who had no freedom. This could not last forever. By 25, Maria Luisa's health was so broken that any illness could kill her. A short sickness, worsened by years of captivity, drained her last strength. She died young, her suffering only the beginning of tragedy. For Philip, the loss struck like lightning. He collapsed beside her body and would not rise. For weeks, he refused to speak, refused food, refused to leave the room. His will to live seemed gone. But this was not grief. It was the beginning of the abyss that would swallow him and his court. For 3 weeks, Spain had no ruler. Ministers were paralyzed. The country drifted without direction. When courtiers finally suggested a new marriage for the sake of stability, his response stunned everyone. He laughed hysterically, then whispered, "She hasn't gone. She is hiding." To him, Maria Luisa was not dead, only hidden, waiting to be found. So he demanded a replacement, not simply a wife, but a copy. The same age, height, ichor, even the same voice. And they found her, Elizabeth Farnese of Parma. In late 1714, Philip married her, but the court understood immediately. This was not a new queen. This was a substitute.
Elizabeth was forced to wear Maria Luisa's dresses, her perfumes, even repeat her words. "She is not a wife," one servant wrote. "She is a mirror." At first, Elizabeth obeyed, playing the role, but soon the king's demands grew harsher. She could not leave without permission, she could not cry, she could never be alone. Day and night, she was required to remain at his side. At the same time, Philip's behavior grew stranger. He refused to wear royal clothes, shaved his head, dressed in coarse monk's robes, and let his nails grow long. Some nights he muttered prayers for hours by the fire, then suddenly burst into laughter or broke down in tears. The court understood. Spain was no longer ruled by a man. It was ruled by his illness. And yet what lay ahead was even more disturbing. A king who refused to govern, but also refused to give up power. By the mid-1720s, Philip could no longer perform his duties. He wouldn't meet ministers, wouldn't sign papers, wouldn't make decisions unless his wife sat beside him. If Elizabeth left the room, he froze in silence, unable to move. In 1724, under pressure from the court and foreign allies, Philip agreed to abdicate. The crown passed to his eldest son, Louis. The boy was just 17, but many saw him as Spain's hope for renewal. For the first time in years, the court could breathe. Spain had a young, energetic king, and the nation was no longer hostage to midnight breakdowns. But the hope was short-lived. After only 7 months, Louis caught smallpox. The disease spread quickly, and in August 1724, the young king was dead. Philip's reaction stunned everyone. Instead of mourning, he declared, "God has returned the crown to the one who must wear it." And just like that, he took the throne again, as if nothing had happened. But the man who returned was not the same. He was broken and dangerous. Spain now had a ruler who feared mirrors, curtains, and sunlight, and who claimed to hear voices whispering from the fireplaces. Though he was king in name, real decisions increasingly passed through Elizabeth Farnese. After reclaiming the crown in 1724, Philip appeared more detached than ever. He avoided meetings, lost the ability to concentrate, and spent long stretches hidden in dark rooms. Servants noted that he was terrified of mirrors, convinced that souls were trapped inside them. Loud noises sent him into hysterics. In silence, he claimed he heard voices, unseen presences whispering around him. In practice, Spain was ruled by his second wife. Every document, every negotiation, every decree went through Elizabeth Farnese. She built the image of a strong regent, but kept herself in the shadows, careful not to provoke the nobility. Philip retreated further into rituals. He wore rough sackcloth robes, refused shoes, and rarely appeared in daylight. Sometimes he repeated prayers for hours by the fire, then suddenly burst into laughter or broke down in tears. Foreign envoys quickly realized Spain was governed by an invisible hand. French and Austrian diplomats wrote home that the kingdom had a king in title, but no king in truth. Meanwhile, Elizabeth used his weakness to expand her power. Through marriages and alliances, she pushed her children into strong positions across Europe. But within the court, whispers grew louder. Behind the palace doors was not simply a weak ruler, but a man lost entirely to reality. He abandoned royal garments completely. Instead of velvet and gold, he wore rough, baggy robes, convinced the fabric shielded him from sin. He stopped cutting his hair and nails, shunned the light, and sometimes refused to leave his bed for weeks, believing that darkness behind the curtains protected his soul. At night, servants heard screams, sobs, endless prayers. By day, he hardly spoke, sometimes repeating the same phrase for hours. He would suddenly hurl himself against the wall, clawing at the stone, shouting at invisible enemies, then lapse into total stillness, lying like a corpse. Elizabeth Farnese controlled everything. She decided who could see him, filtered ambassadors, dictated orders to ministers. At court, they whispered. Spain was ruled not by a king, but by a queen, through pillows and candles in a darkened chamber. For the people, Philip became a figure of myth. Some called him a saint, living in constant prayer. Others believed he was cursed, bringing misfortune on Spain. In the letters of ambassadors, Spain was openly described as the country without a face. And while Europe looked on from a distance, inside the palace, Elizabeth lived in a permanent nightmare. She was no longer a wife. She was a nurse, a guardian of a man who had ceased to be himself. By the mid-1730s, no one at court held illusions anymore. Philip V was king only by name. In reality, he was a prisoner of his fears and rituals. His life reduced to cycles of fits and trances. He stopped appearing in public altogether. Even religious ceremonies, sacred duty for a Catholic monarch, went on without him. He no longer attended Mass, no longer greeted envoys, no longer received ambassadors. Everything in Spain passed through the hands of Elizabeth Farnese. His appearance itself became part of the legend. Instead of royal robes, he wore rough sackcloth like a hermit monk, convinced only such fabric could protect him from temptation. His hair grew into long, tangled strands.
his nails into claws. His chambers reeked of dampness, incense, and an unwashed body that had gone weeks without air or water. His fears were even more disturbing. He ordered all mirrors removed from the palace, believing reflections could steal souls. He dreaded sunlight and hid behind heavy curtains, certain that its rays would destroy him. The toll of church bells made him tremble, and the crackle of a fire sent him into panic attacks. He believed demons were speaking to him through the flames. The palace became a prison-like cloister. Envoys from France, Austria, and England wrote home calling Spain a kingdom without a sovereign. They described a land ruled by a woman, while the king himself had become a living ghost.
Yet Elizabeth Farnese remained beside him. She played her role to the end, wife, nurse, the shadow of the long-dead Maria Luisa. For her, it meant endless days in darkness, surrounded by the stench of fear and hopelessness. She held his hands, repeated the words he demanded, and governed Spain through his sickness. By then, legends spread among the people. Some called the king a martyr, suffering to atone for Spain's sins. Others said he was cursed, and that his madness brought ruin on the nation. Military defeats, loss of prestige, and economic collapse. By the 1740s, Spain ran on autopilot. Bureaucrats, ministers, and the queen kept the machine moving while the monarch lived in seclusion. He no longer carried political weight, yet he remained a symbol, one too dangerous to remove. But the end was inevitable. By 1746, Philip's body could no longer endure. Worn down by decades of sleepless nights, fits, and manic episodes, he was collapsing. In early 1746, his health suddenly worsened. His wasted body no longer obeyed him. He barely rose from bed, refused food, and whispered broken prayers. Servants said he could spend hours repeating the name of Maria Luisa, as if waiting for her to return. Elizabeth stayed close. She was wife, nurse, and mediator between the king and the outside world. No one saw him directly. Ministers dealt only through her, and all documents passed through her hands. The court waited for the end, though no one knew how long it would take. By spring and summer, the crisis deepened. Philip hardly recognized anyone, lost his speech, thrashed in his sleep, caught at the sheets as if trying to escape an invisible trap. Guards heard his cries at night, calling out his dead wife's name until his voice gave out. On July 9, 1746, around 4 in the morning, Philip V died. It happened quietly, without ceremony. His final moments were far from majestic. Damp sheets, trembling hands, and the name of his first wife escaping his lips. For Spain, his death marked not only the end of an era, but a release. The court, the people, even foreign envoys welcomed it as the long-awaited close of a 40-year reign ruled not by ambition or reform, but by obsession and inner demons. History remembered him as king, but behind the title was a figure his own household feared. He entered the record not as builder of empires, but as proof of how personal weakness and dependence can undo an entire nation. By the 1740s, Philip's image had already shifted in the eyes of his contemporaries. To ministers, he was no longer a monarch, but an obstacle to be worked around. All real power lay with Elizabeth Farnese, who secured her children's futures and forged alliances across Europe. At court, the rule was unspoken but clear. One appealed not to the king, but to the queen. French and Austrian envoys described Spain in their reports as a state without a sovereign. They wrote of a kingdom losing its influence, of power reduced to backroom deals, and of a monarch who had become nothing more than a symbol of sickness and fear. Across Europe, whispers grew louder. The throne in Madrid was occupied not by a ruler, but by a ghost. Within Spain, rumors multiplied. People spoke of a king who feared mirrors, hid from the sun, and spent his nights in screams and prayer. Some saw sanctity in this, others saw a curse upon the dynasty.
Meanwhile, Spain itself weakened. The economy stagnated, its influence abroad diminished, and its armies faltered without strong leadership. The court lived in constant tension. No one dared declare Philip unfit to rule, yet everyone knew the throne was an empty shell. Madrid lived under a heavy, uncertain atmosphere. The palace felt like a sealed, airless chamber. The kingdom seemed suspended, waiting for an end that would finally free it from a decades-long nightmare. On July 9, 1746, Spain awoke in silence. Philip V had died in his palace, delirious, whispering his first wife's name. His passing was not marked by grandeur, but by relief. A nation that had lived 40 years under the shadow of his obsessions could finally breathe. In Europe's capitals, the news was met without shock. No one had expected reforms or victories from Philip. He had long been seen as lost to power. For diplomats, he remained the symbol of a weakened dynasty. And for historians, he would always be the enigma. The king who ruled millions, but could never rule himself. King whose name appears on the list of Spain's rulers, yet whose life reads more like that of a recluse. His reign stands as a rare example of how private wounds and inner fears can shape the fate of an entire nation. In place of politics, dependency. In place of reform, prayers and fits. In place of royal authority, a closed room and curtains that hid the sound of screams. The memory of Philip V in Spain is divided. Official chronicles praise his role in preserving the Bourbon dynasty and arranging dynastic marriages that tied Europe together. But behind those lines lies another truth. A country governed by a man consumed by his own demons. Historians remember him not as a builder or reformer, but as the obsessed king. His legacy was not new cities or victories on the battlefield, but whispers, diaries of courtiers, and the memories of servants too afraid to look toward the royal bedchamber. Thus ended one of the strangest, most unsettling chapters in Spanish history, the reign of a monarch who ruled millions, yet could never master himself.